Imagine standing at the entrance of a medieval city. Not the version from paintings or films, but the real one. The smell reaches you before the walls do, something between rot and smoke and animal waste baked into cobblestone. You hear the city before you see it clearly, the cartwheels, the livestock, the shouting. And then you step inside, and you understand immediately that this place operates by rules entirely different from anything you have ever known. Medieval cities were not dirty by accident. They were dirty by design, or rather by the absence of it. Dense populations crowded into walled enclosures, animals living alongside humans, waste with nowhere to go. Water shared between cooking and disposal. These were not failures of character. They were the predictable outcome of a world that had no framework for what a city needed to survive its own growth. The smell was the first language of the medieval city. Every street had its own register of odor. The tanner's quarter carried the stench of hides soaking in urine and bark. The butcher's lane was dark with blood and flies in summer. The baker's row offered warmth and yeast. The market square offered everything else at once: fish on wooden slabs, vegetables rotting at the edges, manure from horses tied to posts, mud churned into something thick and complex by 1,000 daily feet. This was not a sign of decay, it was a sign of life. The medieval city was a functioning organism, producing and consuming and discarding at every hour. The problem was that it had no system for managing what it produced. The wall defined the city, and the wall made the problem worse. Medieval cities were built for defense, not expansion. The outer wall was a fixed boundary, and everything inside it had to adapt to pressure without relief. As populations grew through the 12th and 13th centuries, cities like London, Paris, and Cologne absorbed thousands of new residents without adding meaningful infrastructure. Streets that were built for 50 households were now serving 500. The density was extraordinary. In some neighborhoods of Paris, a single block housed more people per square meter than modern urban centers in the developing world. And every one of those people produced waste, consumed water, kept animals, and lit fires for heat and cooking. The wall held all of it inside. Animals were not a feature of the rural fringe. They were central to urban life. Horses pulled the carts that moved goods through every city. Pigs were kept in household yards, fed on kitchen scraps, allowed to wander in some cities where they served as informal refuse clearers. Chickens lived on rooftops and in narrow alleys. Cattle were driven through main streets to slaughterhouses positioned inside the city walls. Because refrigeration did not exist, and the animal had to reach the butcher alive. The waste from this constant animal presence was not managed. It accumulated. It mixed with rainwater and flowed into the same gutters that served as drainage channels for everything else. It dried into dust in summer. It turned to slick mud in winter. The city floor was never clean, it was never meant to be. Water was the most critical resource and the most dangerous one. Every medieval city organized itself around access to water. Rivers, wells, and fountains were the infrastructure that made urban density possible. But they were also the vectors through which disease traveled without anyone understanding the mechanism. The River Thames in London received the city's waste directly. The Seine in Paris did the same. Wells were dug close to cesspits because proximity was practical, not because anyone understood contamination. The water that came up from a city well in the 13th century carried what the soil around it had absorbed. And what the soil absorbed was everything. Cholera would not be named for centuries. Typhoid was invisible as a concept. People knew that certain water made you sick. They did not know why. The cesspit was the foundation of medieval urban sanitation, such as it was. Every household that could afford construction dug one. A lined pit beneath or behind the dwelling, intended to receive human waste and contain it. When full, a cesspit had to be emptied by workers called gongfirmers, or night soil men who worked after dark to reduce the offense to neighbors. They used buckets and carts and took the contents to fields outside the city, where it was sold as agricultural fertilizer. This system functioned imperfectly. Cesspits overflowed during heavy rain. They leaked into adjacent foundations. They contaminated wells at distances that seemed safe but were not. And in the poorer quarters of any city, Where construction was informal and space was minimal, the cesspit was replaced by the street itself. The street was the city's default disposal system. Households on upper floors emptied chamber pots from windows with a shouted warning. Slaughterhouse waste drained toward the nearest gutter. Workshops dumped tanning chemicals, dye residue, and processing byproducts into the same channels that carried surface rainwater. The gutter was a shared infrastructure that received everything and filtered nothing. Cities passed ordinances. London issued statutes requiring residents to clean the street in front of their properties. Paris established rules against dumping waste in public ways. These rules existed because the problem was visible and persistent. They were enforced inconsistently, and the underlying conditions that produced the problem were never addressed. You cannot legislate against gravity, and in a city with no drainage system, gravity brought everything to the lowest available point. Fire was not a luxury in the medieval city. It was survival. Every household burned wood or charcoal through the cold months. Smiths and bakers and brewers and chandlers operated furnaces and kilns inside the city walls throughout the year. The smoke from this constant combustion sat over the city in a layer that changed the quality of the air and deposited soot on every surface. Fires also destroyed. The combination of dense timber construction, dry summer conditions, and open flames meant that urban fires were not exceptional events. They were recurring ones. London burned repeatedly. Cities across France and the Holy Roman Empire lost entire quarters to fire in single nights. After a major fire, rebuilding happened quickly and without regulation, because the alternative was leaving people without shelter through winter. The rebuilt city was often denser than the one that burned. Markets were the heart of the medieval city, and among its most intense sources of contamination. Every market day brought livestock, butchered meat, fish, vegetables, grains, and thousands of people into a concentrated space. The ground of a market square after a busy day in summer was a composite of animal waste, discarded food, spilled blood, and mud. The smell carried for blocks.
Here, take some.
Fish markets required proximity to water, which meant proximity to rivers already carrying urban runoff. Meat markets produced offal and bone and blood in quantities that overwhelmed any informal disposal system. Grain stored in damp conditions attracted rats, and rats moved through every layer of the city, from the market floor to the granary ceiling to the timber walls of private homes. The rat was not an occasional visitor. It was a permanent resident. Plague moved through this infrastructure with terrifying efficiency. When the Black Death arrived in Western Europe in 1347, it found conditions almost perfectly suited to its spread. Dense populations, contaminated water, persistent rodent presence, streets that mixed human and animal waste without separation. Cities that had been accumulating the byproducts of a century of growth with no mechanism for dispersal. The disease killed between 30 and 60% of Europe's urban population in 4 years. In some cities, the proportion was higher. The dead accumulated faster than the living could process them. Mass graves were opened at the edges of cities. The normal rites of burial collapsed under volume. People did not understand what had caused this, but many understood at some level that the city itself had become a system they could no longer trust. The aftermath of plague forced a slow reckoning with the built environment. Cities that survived the 14th century began to ask in practical terms what had failed. The answers were partial and often incorrect, but the impulse to reform was real. Regulations around waste disposal became more specific. Some cities began to invest in paved street surfaces that allowed water to flow rather than pool. Butchery was moved toward city edges in several northern European towns. The concept of urban health did not yet exist in a scientific sense, but the experience of watching a city empty itself through disease produced a practical knowledge that accumulated across generations. Something was wrong with the way the city was built. Something needed to change about the relationship between people and the ground they walked on. Change came slowly, unevenly, and never completely within the medieval period. By the 15th century, some cities had made modest infrastructural investments. Stone gutters in better neighborhoods, covered channels in a few market streets, more consistent enforcement of waste removal in wealthy districts. The poorest quarters remained as they had been for 2 centuries. The animals remained. The cesspits remained. The proximity of water supply to waste disposal remained. The medieval city was not transformed by the lessons of plague. It was nudged. The transformation would require a different century, a different understanding of what caused disease, and eventually a political will to invest public resources in invisible infrastructure. But something had shifted. The city had learned at enormous cost that it could not grow indefinitely without also building the systems to sustain that growth. The streets had taught that lesson. The dead had confirmed it. We remember the Middle Ages for its cathedrals, its crusades, its courts. We forget the mud. We forget the smell that greeted every traveler at the gate. We forget that the people who built those cathedrals went home through streets shared with pigs and horse carts and open drainage channels. We forget that the water they drank came from wells that received the city's secrets. The medieval city was not a failure of civilization. It was a civilization operating at the edge of what its systems could support, without the knowledge to know it was there. The dirt was not ignorance. It was the shape of a world still learning what a city truly required to endure. My name is Victor, and this has been Imperial Reborn.